Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Museum of Science live program. Every year, our current science and technology team makes their picks for the 10 most exciting, influential, important, and coolest stories from the world of science from the last 12 months. This year has been very different in so many ways, but we still wanted to share our list with you, which we'll be doing all January long. 2 weeks ago, we kicked off our countdown with an honorable mention story. Didn't quite make the countdown, but our team was delighted to learn that scientists discovered the duck-billed platypus glows in the dark. Our number 10 story was the Atlantic hurricane season of 2020, which broke many records. Number 9 was the recreation of a voice of a 3,000-year-old Egyptian mummy using a CT scan and 3D printing. Last week, we continued our countdown with our number 8 story, an interesting discovery that hinted at life on Venus. Number 7 involved the first ever dinosaur, confirmed to be an avid swimmer, the Spinosaurus. And we left off with number 6, the awarding of the Nobel Prize in Chemistry to 2 women for their groundbreaking work on editing DNA. If you missed those live streams, but you're interested in more details, you can catch the replays anytime on our Facebook or YouTube page. In a moment, I'll be joined by 3 of my fellow Museum of Science educators, and we'll continue our countdown today with our picks for number 5, 4, and 3. And next week, we'll be back with our exciting finale to reveal our picks for the number 2 and number 1 story of the year. My name is Eric, my pronouns are he, him, and I'll be your moderator for this session, which means I'll be fielding all the questions that you ask our panelists. Please do begin asking questions about the stories or the process of how we selected them at any time using the Q&A button on Zoom. If you'd like to see captions on Zoom, you can click on the Close Captions button at the bottom of your screen and select Show Captions. And if you're joining us on Facebook or YouTube, we won't be able to see your questions or comments, but we're happy you're tuning in. So at this point, I'd like to invite my panelists to turn on their cameras, introduce themselves, and we'll get started.
Hi, my name is Mayra. I use the pronouns she and her, and this is my very first year joining the top 10. So I'm super excited to be able to talk about some of the stories here today. And I loved watching you guys last year, so I love being part of it this year.
Hi everyone, my name is Megan. I use the pronoun she, hers. This is actually my 5th top 10. That was I had to count quite a bit. It was kind of a shocking number. And my favorite part of this process is when we typically do it in-house at the museum. It's a huge challenge to fit 10 stories, really 11 stories in 20 minutes and learn all those stories and teach all those stories. So it's just like a big push for me and it's a lot of fun.
Hi everyone, my name is Pablo. I use the pronouns he and him, and this is my 3rd year doing the top 10 science stories. So it's always very exciting. And just like Megan, I always learn a lot. I always realize how much I've missed, even though I've been trying to keep up with the news and with exciting science. I'm always surprised of how much I've learned throughout the year and how much more there was to learn in the year. So it's always really exciting.
All right, well, there was certainly a lot of buzz around our first entry today. Myra, can you tell us about our number 5 story this year?
I will say that I also love your puns. I loved them last year, and this year does not disappoint. Yes, so we can talk about our number 5 story, which this year was Murder Hornets. So you may remember last year in March-ish, April, there were all of these posts and the news was all talking about the murder hornets. You might also be wondering why this is our number 5 story if this only lasted a couple of weeks. But it turns out that the hornets didn't just disappear or go away. Instead, turns out that the Washington State Department of Agriculture, or WSDA, has been working all year really, really hard in order to eradicate this species. So let's do a quick refresher on what these are. So these are the largest species of hornets in the world, and they are native to Asia, which is why their original common name was Asian giant hornet, and their scientific name was Vespa mandarina. Now, the reason that this species was in the news was because this was the very first time that they had been found here in the United States. And they were given the nickname murder hornets, not because they're particularly dangerous or deadly to humans, although they can be, but mostly because they're very, very dangerous to bees. This is a picture of what these hornets can do. Within just a few hours, they can completely decimate a previously healthy colony of bees. As you can see here, most of these bees have been decapitated. And that would be terrifying if you're a beekeeper and happen to walk outside and just see this massacre from one of your beehives. And because so much of our economy and agriculture depends on bees, it would be really, really bad if these hornets were able to take hold here in the United States. So what have we done about it? Well, like I said, WSDA has been working really hard all year. They set up over 1,000 traps all over the state of Washington, but really focusing on the counties where we knew that we'd seen them already. And we're able to actually catch some live hornets. Now, this is important because we don't really know where the hornets are. Unfortunately, they tend to have their hives underground and have like little opening about that size where they come out of, which is impossible to find unless you know where you're looking. Also, like I said, they are native to Asia, which means that we don't actually know how they act here in the United States. So they were able to get live ones. They were able to put trackers on them. This one in particular is a radio tracker that they put on a hornet, and we're actually able to follow one back to its hive. Now, like I said, we didn't know exactly how they would act here in the United States versus how they act in Asia. And it turns out that at least this one in particular, the hive was in a tree rather than underground. And it was inside of the tree with just, again, a similar opening. The entomologist that followed it back to the hive says that had they not been literally tracking it, even if they were standing right underneath it, they never would have seen it. So how did they eradicate it? So in October, the WSDA performed the very first eradication of a hive here in the United States. And as you can see, they wrapped up the tree completely in plastic so that the hornets couldn't get out. And then they tried to back up as many as they could. And you can see there in the back, somebody was hitting them with a plank because it was a really cold day. The hornets were not moving, so they actually had to agitate them enough to get the hornets to come out of that hive. And you might also notice this beekeeper outfit that they are wearing. It's different than a normal beekeeper outfit. In fact, they had to have this specially made for mortar hornets because, and here you can see where the hornets have been captured. They aren't moving much. Like I said, it was a cold day, but once they got them back to the lab, they started acting like normal, and scientists are able to perform tests on them. And like I said, those, that beekeeper outfit, it's specially made for the murder hornets because their stinger is bigger and could actually go through a regular beekeeper outfit. What's really interesting is that nobody got stung or the hornets didn't even try to sting anybody. So we don't technically know if it works. So hopefully we never have to find out, but I just found that interesting too. Cool.
Yeah, this was one of those news stories that got big right in April and May when the pandemic had already kind of turned the world on its head, and it was like now there's murder hornets. Great. Do you think that this story would have been so big if they just had a different name, if it was just like the greater yellow hornet?
I think that the nickname definitely helped get all of that media attention because that name is very, very terrifying. So of course you're going to pay attention to something called a murder hornet rather than just the Asian giant hornet is not quite as catchy.
We got a question from Alicia. How large can the hornets get?
These hornets can get about 2 to 2.5 inches long, which is pretty significant. And I don't remember exactly how big the stinger is, but it is a lot bigger than that of a bee. So that's what you got to worry about there.
It's reminding me of Jumanji a little bit, like the giant beast. Yeah.
Yeah, I love a lot of the stories that we've had this year have been technology as a way to study something either that we knew a lot about but found something new. And the technology in the story is so cool. I mean, the brand new murder hornet proof suits and the murder hornet vacuum. But the coolest part is the tracker. I mean, 30 years ago, we could track birds by like putting something on them and then physically reading it and hoping to catch that same bird again. And so you would put something on the leg of 50 birds and then hope that one of them turned up in the same spot the next year. And now we can attach a little radio tag to a 2-inch hornet and track it back to its nest in order to eradicate it. It's so cool.
Yeah, I also love that like they had originally tried Bluetooth trackers and those weren't working properly. Like the hornet would get back to the hive and then they'd lose it. And it's really interesting to know that like it was a WSDA and USDA, so the United States Department of Agriculture, working together in order to get that radio tracker just so that they could do it this once. But thankfully it worked. And now hopefully next year, they know exactly how to track them.
I only want to add that I think the name of murder hornets, even though incredibly dramatic, right? And it got people like maybe blew the story even a little bit out of proportion. But I think that there's so many invasive species in the US that maybe there is a tiny, tiny little bit of an argument to make these really dramatic names, because then all of a sudden people really pay attention to it. Because there are like billions of dollars that the US spends on controlling these invasive species. And sometimes people don't really realize how the huge impact that it has, right? So maybe a little weird way of getting attention to an important problem.
That is definitely a thing that entomologists were talking about and like having, not an argument, what's a debate on whether like this is a good thing or a bad thing to like have this name that catches attention and that's good, but also it makes people even more scared of insects, which is not good. So there's pros and cons.
All right, well, we're going to move on to our next story. Megan, do you want to tell us about number 4?
I do. All right. So for our number 4 story, we're going to be taking a look at the record-breaking wildfire season that we really saw not only here in the United States, but really across the globe, most notably in the Western United States and in Australia. So those are the two sort of areas of the world that we're going to be focusing on for this story. So Australia's bushfire season, so their seasons are opposite to ours. So right now they are in summer as we are in winter, and their bushfire season is really going from like September 2019 to about May 2020 was when those final fires were being put out. And they were particularly prominent in January 2020. So it was just at the very beginning of this year that we had to kind of bring back to our minds of like, wait, whoa, that was this year? Like, yes, that was this year. That was 2020. So when it came to Australia, they saw 46 million acres was burned in these different fires across Australia. You'll also notice in that map there, all of those little pings are locations of fires. So while the colors don't necessarily mean intensity, it's more of a key for when they were found. It really just shows you exactly how many fires were all over Australia. Now, of course, there was people in those areas and animals in those areas, and they certainly suffered at the hands of these fires. You can see in that picture there, that was actually someone's home that is very clearly damaged by the fires, and you can tell there's little to no vegetation left behind. So almost 6,000 buildings were destroyed, and almost half of those were people's homes, which is really a terrible place to be. And then, of course, like I said, animals were also definitely affected. Australia is really well known for having really unique wildlife. And it's thought that 3 billion animals were affected by the fires in one way or another. That's not even counting the countless insects that were probably affected too, were definitely affected too. And it's thought that a lot of species that were endangered or threatened prior to these fires, some of them could have even gone extinct. And they're trying to still sort of catch up with what exactly happened and what exactly was those impacts over in Australia. Now, like I mentioned, the Western United States also saw a really record-breaking wildfire season. So that was really California, areas of Oregon and Washington that saw a lot of fires. And that season was from summer 2020. So it really started in mid-August and went through the end of fall 2020. And it really started with just very, very dry conditions. And there was a very unusual early lightning storm that caused like a couple sparks that eventually rolled into larger fires. And it was really just these very dry conditions that laid the groundwork for those fires to happen in the first place, or sort of before the usual fire season. And in that area, they saw 4.1 million acres burned. A lot of that area is where people live. So over, I think, 10,000 buildings were damaged. You can see in the picture on this slide here, that's actually just a chimney that's remaining from someone's home. So almost virtually nothing left except for that chimney. And of course, that really characteristic haze of smoke that's around that's really trapped. And finally, notably, there was the first gigafire recorded in California in decades. So there's different levels for classifying fires depending on how much area, how much acreage they burned, and a gigafire will burn over 1 million acres. So it's the Augusta Complex fire that was burning over 1 million acres, just that single fire. So definitely some record-breaking happening here. Now, also just thinking of those US wildfires, there was, of course, those dry conditions that made it possible and sort of natural occurrences that were causing these wildfires, but also human behavior. So something that really floated around I saw on my social media was a particular fire called the El Dorado fire was started by a couple going out and doing a gender reveal. So they used a pyrotechnic device that would explode and show a certain color to indicate the sex of their baby. And unfortunately, that ended up resulting in a fire that was really out of control and was one of the largest fires that that area had ever seen in its history. It's really starting with a human choice there. And then the other thing that got a lot of coverage was this orange haze that was, of course, in the Western United States. You see here, this is the Golden Gate Bridge. That is not filtered. That is the orange haze that was in that area that was resulting from those fires, from all that smoke getting trapped. We also saw it here on the Eastern coast. So it wasn't just staying on that Western coast, it moved across the US. This is the sun at the very top of the Bunker Hill Monument here in Boston. And that sun is nice and high in the sky. And you can see that there's just this haze right on over it, showing the sun to be sort of this orange color. So these concerns weren't just really only on the Western coast. They're really affecting us as a country and our air quality as a country.
Yeah, lots and lots of headlines on this a couple different times in 2020. Why was it so destructive? What were the causes behind it?
Yeah, there's, of course, that's the question that people are asking, like, who did it? Like, what could we have done to prevent it, right? We want answers. People want answers for this devastation. And there's a lot of finger pointing going on. Of course, sort of the obvious is climate change. Climate change is changing precipitation patterns. So there's really extreme droughts in areas of our world that are causing really dry conditions. California saw, I think it was August, September, and October were all the warmest months on record in California for those months. It was the warmest year in 2020. And so it just left really dry conditions, and all it took was a simple lightning strike. And that was the beginning of it. That was the same thing for Australia too, as they had really dry conditions and very low moisture in their soil, all sort of resulting from those changes in precipitation patterns from climate change. The other thing that's coming into play is people are pointing to the fire management practices that have been used over time. Typically, when it comes to fire management, for the last 50 to 60 years or so, we've been putting out every single fire that has come up naturally or human-made out in, say, the forest. And although that sounds like a good thing, right? Of course, there's people's homes out there, there's animal homes out there. It sounds like a good thing to put those fires out, but fire is a natural part of the ecosystem. And so it helps sort of get rid of all the stuff that's dead and dry and makes way for more space for new things to grow that's lush and green and not as flammable. So by putting out every fire that we see, a bunch of dry stuff is just going to build up, and it's just making more and more kindling till eventually something lights it. So there's been some advocacy for changing our approach to management when it comes to those wildfires.
Yeah, it's hard to have a perfect balance of letting the fires burn just the right amount when there's so much human habitation everywhere. We kind of don't have many places where we can just let burn without it affecting something that we've built somewhere. So it's really tough.
Yeah, absolutely. There are some options of course, like choosing the right day and the weather conditions and having trained professionals do it in a very controlled way. But it takes a lot of resources to do it and a lot of convincing for communities to allow it to even happen.
We got a question from Ben, who's 5. How can forest fires spread so quickly and so far?
Oh, that's a great question, Ben. So often it has to do, again, with all of those materials that are going to be around. It's just acts as fuel for the fire. And so as long as there's something there, that fire is going to continue to catch. Also, the weather conditions are really what's going to impact how fast that fire is able to spread. Things like wind can push a fire up the side of a hill more quickly than you could predict. So those day-to-day weather patterns are really going to impact how that fire can spread. But luckily, firefighters have really great techniques for trying to break that stuff up, and actually will break apart and dig these big trenches to try and stop the fire right in its tracks before it's able to continue to spread.
All right. We're going to move on to our last entry for today, which is Out of This World. Pablo, can you tell us about number 3?
Yes, of course. So this Out of This World story is really about something very exciting that happened this year, which is the launch of astronauts from the United States. The last time that happened was back in 2011, when the space shuttle took some astronauts over to space, to the International Space Station. But ever since, the US has relied on Russian spacecrafts in order to send people to orbit. And that has resulted in a really, really expensive taxi ride over to space. But for the last couple of years, 5 years or so, 2 companies have started to work on a commercial flight on creating these programs where they can just bring people to space. And these 2 companies are Boeing and SpaceX. Boeing is still working on their spacecraft, but SpaceX has been doing a whole lot of testing. And back in May of 2020, for the first time, as I said, they launched astronauts from the United States over to the International Space Station. So basically what they did is that they used the rocket that you see over on the screen to the left. That's the Falcon 9 rocket. And the Crew Dragon spacecraft is kind of that capsule, the very tippy top that sent the astronauts over to the International Space Station. And these were Bob and Doug, who stayed in the International Space Station for quite some time, and they successfully came back. And over in November, this whole drill was repeated once again. The astronauts are over at the International Space Station right now, and they will be coming back later this year. I was going to say next year, but no, this year. So this is very exciting for a couple of reasons. As I said, the NASA now doesn't rely on Russian spacecrafts, which is a country that we haven't had the best relationship with for a long time. So it's great that it can be done in the US now. And there's some other exciting stuff in that it is a much cheaper flight over to the International Space Station, especially because that Falcon 9 rocket can be reused many, many, many times, which makes it great and very ideal and much, much cheaper. And the capsule also has room for 4 passengers, 4 astronauts. That's 1 more than what we have been doing for the last decade or so. And that means that more things can get done at the International Space Station. You have 1 more person and you can do a whole lot of research over in the International Space Station. And the good news is that all of this research really serves the purpose of kind of thinking ahead of the future missions over to the moon, returning to the moon once again, or even going to places that are a little bit more adventurous like Mars in the future. So it's all really important groundwork. And on a personal note, it's just so exciting to see rockets go into space.
Yeah, this was a really cool story that we've been waiting for the last couple years, waiting for either SpaceX or Boeing to get their spaceship ready, test it, finalize it, make it safe enough, and then launch astronauts. And it seemed like it might happen in 2018, and then we were crossing our fingers for 2019, and then middle of 2020, we made it, and we watched the launch on our live stream, and it was just so cool. I love it.
Pablo, just out of curiosity, you said it was the most expensive taxi ride, and I just want to know, how expensive was that taxi ride?
What I checked, and maybe someone has to fact check me, but what I had read is that it was something like $80 million per seat, which is incredibly expensive. So yeah, it's a lot of money going into these flights. So
getting up there. Wow. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I mean, part of why we retired the space shuttle program was because that wasn't as cheap as we had hoped when we developed it in the 1970s. We thought we could send the space shuttle to space every other week or so, and it would be cheap to just go up and come down. It turned out to not be the case. And then it was much more expensive to pay for rides for other rockets. So the fact that the Falcon 9 rocket that they launch people on now is reusable. I mean, they just set a new record this morning. They launched a Falcon 9 with some satellites, and that rocket had been used 8 times, and they landed it, and they'll use it again a 9th time. And so just imagining how much cheaper it is to be able to reuse rockets instead of having to build a brand new one every time. The space shuttle was largely reusable, but a lot of it had to be rebuilt and tested every time. SpaceX is getting really good at it. And so it's really exciting to know that we'll be launching astronauts to the space station for another couple of years, decade or more, with this rocket and with Boeing's coming up, and we'll be able to do so much more.
Now, Eric, I have a question for you, because I was, when I was reading about this, it kept coming up and it kept being hinted, but, you know, there's a lot of talk about maybe in the future having tourism over in space, right? People going in these big rockets, being launched to space, get the pretty view, and come back. Do you foresee this happening like anytime soon?
I really think so. Yeah. It's the same as this story here, where we've been waiting and waiting for the commercial crew program to finally launch astronauts. And then this year it did. And it's just going to become a regular thing. It was the same for reusable rockets. SpaceX said they were going to reuse their rocket. And then for 5 years, everyone said there's no way that they could possibly do that. And now it's routine. They do it every single time they launch a rocket almost. And so I think that maybe even 10, 15 years from now, it won't be cheap. It won't be, you know, your choice between, do you want to go to New York City for the weekend or do you want to go to space for a couple minutes? But especially with suborbital, meaning you go up, you cross the line of space, you get to look out the window and see the stars and float for about 5 minutes, and then you immediately fall back down to Earth, and the whole thing only takes maybe 20 minutes. There's a couple other companies besides SpaceX that are getting really good at that too. And it will be pretty expensive to start out with, but as we get better at rockets and get better at have more companies doing it and competing with each other, maybe not spending a week on the moon anytime soon, but spending a couple minutes in space might be not that unreasonable pretty soon. It's really exciting.
You think it'll be about 80 million?
It might be less than 80 million, but it might be more than 80,000.
Well, there's room in there.
And hopefully they'll have like a lottery or something where people get to do it for free when they win a contest. All right, well, it seems like a good time to deorbit our live stream and break it in for landing for today. Be sure to tune in next week as we reveal our number 2 and number 1 story for the year. I'd like to thank my panelists and say goodbye.
Thank you.
And I'd like to thank all of you for tuning in and asking such great questions. I'm so sorry we couldn't get to them all. We've got a lot of other digital content for you to enjoy, from other live streams on different subjects to our podcast, Pulsar, that answers some of the best questions we've ever been asked at the museum, to short science videos. Follow us on our social media or check out our website, mos.org/mosathome, to see what else we're up to. If you enjoyed today's presentation, please visit engage.mos.org/welcome to support MOS at Home. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you next week for our exciting conclusion.